Autumn, the final threshold between summer and winter. From the hot, passionate summer, we go into the icy cold winter. It's almost December, so let us recap the stories of the autumn. Grab a blanket, turn off your lights for 3 true scary ghost stories that happened in the fall. An autumn evening. It was the autumn of 2006 when my story took place, which makes me 10 years old at the time. I was in my grandmother's kitchen, and my brother, grandmother, and I were watching something on TV. Let me describe the living room. When you walk in there from the kitchen, dead ahead there's the balcony door, and just about more than half a meter beside the door is a couch. The TV is just left by the wall. By the right wall is another couch, where my brother and grandmother were sitting. I was sitting on the couch by the door, not really paying attention to whatever we were watching. I've also made it a habit to look through the glass door, because Swedish autumn evenings are kind of mysterious, and somehow fascinating. I was shocked to see a woman outside the door. She was tall, about 180 centimeters, and had curly hair that reached her back. She was wearing something that looked like a 19th century ball gown. Her eyes were staring straight forward, and I don't think she saw me. But she didn't look like a regular person. She was like water. You could see right through her, but it was grayish water. The woman looked to be about 19 to 20 years old. She was stretching her hand forward as if she was going to open the door, but just as she was about to touch the handle, she vanished. Now I'm 14 years old, and this still interests me. When I was 12, I was on a camp with some friends. We were telling ghost stories, and I told the story. Then something I never expected happened. Daniel told me he had seen the same woman too. Apparently my description fitted the woman he had seen perfectly. When I was 11, however, I was in a theater group. It was the day of the show, and we had just acted it out for the first time, and we were going to have lunch. Only Nick and I were left, and I told her too about this mysterious woman. She said immediately that the woman I had seen was the White Lady. She was a good spirit, but I was lucky. The White Lady has a twin, namely the Black Lady, who is an evil spirit. If you have seen this peculiar woman, tell me. I've been wondering about this for a while. One autumn night. During my freshman year of high school, my oldest brother told me a story of how he and his friends visited an old rundown farmhouse in a small clearing in the woods not too far from where we lived. He had heard that the place was haunted, and he and his friends were always into that sort of thing, so they went to check it out. My brother said that once they got inside, he saw red writing on the walls that said things like, "I love you, Sane." There were also a few pentagrams and Bibles in the fireplace. My brother then said one of his friends began getting very jittery and kept saying that he could hear something until he panicked and ran off. My brother and the rest of his friends followed him, and he claimed that they heard a scream as they left. Needless to say, they didn't stay any longer. Now I love my brother, but he's a pathological liar, and I didn't believe a word of it. Fast forward to my junior year in high school, and me and my 3 best friends, Sam, Cody, and Ryan, were hanging out at Sam's house. It was the first Friday after football season, so we had the night to ourselves and we were getting bored. Somehow we got on the topic of ghosts and creepy stories, and I told them about the story my brother told me. We had a few laughs about it, but then Ryan and Cody said they wanted to go check it out. It wasn't that far. My brother had told me where it was, and we drove by the path and apparently led to it quite often. So I said, why not? And we grabbed some flashlights, piled in the car, and headed out. I was convinced that if there was anything there, it would more than likely be an unremarkable heap of rubble. But Cody and Ryan were adamant that we check it out. Once we arrived, We walked down the narrow path through the woods that led to my brother's haunted house. We were joking and laughing the whole time about who was gonna crack and run off first, and how we should have brought some girls and some other stupid stuff. Then, after just a few minutes, we reached the clearing where the house was. Immediately, I felt a profound sense of dread as I looked at the dark house. All I could think about is how this was stupid and we should just leave. As I later said, it looked like it was covered in the shadow of hell. We all stopped laughing and talking at this point. I think we were all a little bit nervous, but we were stupid teenage guys, and none of us wanted to be the first to back out. Cody and Ryan went first, while Sam and I were about 10 feet behind them. As we got closer to the house, I thought I saw a tall dark figure standing about 10 feet to my right looking at me. I shined my light to where I thought I saw the figure, but there was nothing there. I shrugged, thinking that the figure was just all in my head and that there was nothing there. A few moments later, Cody and Ryan reached the front door and we were about to go in. That's when Sam grabbed my arm and quietly said, "We need to go." I have known Sam since the 4th grade, and I've never seen that look on his face. He was very pale and looked utterly terrified, as if he was moments away from passing out. Without another word, he turned around and started walking back towards the car. I called out to Cody and Ryan that we had to go now. They called out to us saying that we were pansies and a few other insults, but I hardly heard them. At this point, I was getting pretty worried, so I ran up to Sam and asked what he saw. He just told me that it was nothing, and they just needed to go and not to look back. Cody and Ryan quickly joined us, but to my surprise, they weren't making fun of us anymore, and no one said a word on the walk back to the car. Once we got back to the car, I asked Sam what he saw. He said that around the time I looked over at the shadow figure, he said he felt wrong. He said after that moment, every step he took towards the house made him feel worse. He said his head was spinning, he felt sick, and an indescribable feeling that something was very wrong. When he grabbed my arm, he said if he had to take one more step, he would have thrown up. I told him what I'd seen. Then Cody and Ryan had said that when we turned around, they felt it get colder, and they swear they heard a whispering voice behind them. Convinced we had run into something evil, we collectively said a prayer and went back to Sam's house. Over the next few days, Ryan, Cody, and I, though a little bit on edge about what we have experienced, felt calm and relaxed enough to joke about it a little bit or try to explain away some of what happened. But above all else, we agreed not to do anything like that again. Sam, on the other hand, was clearly very disturbed by what happened, which isn't surprising, I suppose, since what happened to him was by far the most dramatic. He had trouble sleeping and would have wild mood swings and would get very upset if anyone asked what was wrong. He was always kind of a hothead, but his temper just got out of control not long after that night. However, above all else, he refused to talk about that night. I know he was keeping something from us. Either he saw something or he experienced something more than what we described. I sense he was keeping something from us that night in the car, and to this day, I still believe it. After that night, I started finding scratches on my chest and stomach. I probably see them about once a month, and they were never very deep. At first, I dismissed them as being from my dog, but then I got them in college as well. Cody and Ryan would get scratches on their backs, and those would be deep and seem to occur more frequently. Again, we have no real explanation for them, and theirs also happened in college. And I believe are still happening to this day, while mine seem to have stopped. Sam never wanted to talk about it, so we never asked if he had the same thing. We all went to separate colleges and gradually grew apart as we graduated and got jobs, though we remain in touch. However, as luck would have it, Sam got a job very close to where I am now living and working. He seems to be doing better. He has a wife and family, and we occasionally meet up for drinks or to work out or any number of things. I discovered this site, and it reminded me of that night. I was thinking back on it, and decided to bring it up to Sam again. So one night over drinks, I brought it up. He suddenly grew very serious and looked at me with a very blank face and said, "Don't ever bring that up to me again. I ended it right there and never brought it up again. Any thoughts on the matter? Real or collective hysteria? A walk by the lake at night. Hello all. This specific story that I would like to share is one that's passed down to me from my late granddad. The circumstances are so unusual, so unlike anything I've ever heard, that it's been in the back of my mind for nearly 20 years, ever since it was first told to me when I was a child. My granddad was a great talker and storyteller in his own way, and my family agrees that he wouldn't mind if I shared it with others. I had originally posted this story to a different subreddit, but I didn't realize at the time that it was for fictional stories, so I moved it here because this story, as incredible as it may sound, is completely true. The look on my granddad's face every time he told this story, well, you could tell that it shook him up. First, I'll need to give a little background. My granddad was born in the early 20s in a dirt floor, 2-room farmhouse in rural South Carolina. An only child of sharecroppers during the Great Depression, he was a premature baby, and his parents, already having lost one infant, were understandably protective of him. I'm sure they were relieved and very happy that he was a strong and healthy child, a bit with an incredible amount of wanderlust, restless and energetic. He almost always finished his chores as quickly as he could, so he could take up his little fishing rod and roam to his heart's content. Back then, even horse-drawn carts were a rarity on those long-gone dirt roads. Cars were practically unheard of in that part of the country in those days. Disliking horses, but still greatly desiring to put as much distance between home and himself as he could in the span of an afternoon, my granddad had little choice other than to walk. And walk he did. He combed through miles of wood, fields, and swampland, barefoot as the day he came into this world, heedless of brambles or snake. They wouldn't bother him if he didn't bother them. As much as he enjoyed it, it was a lonely business. His father was a hale man, but with acres of land to help tend, as well as livestock, he hardly had the time to join his son on his walks. Sometimes, one of the local boys would go with him, but that wasn't often. So, being practically kin to everyone within a 30-mile radius, my granddad took up the grand old southern tradition of going visiting. One of his favorite places to go was to Uncle Peter's. Uncle Peter lived on one of those branches of the lake that stretched across a goodly portion of the county. It was a tiny shack, hardly more than a shanty, and barely big enough to fit both him and his spinster sister, Henrietta. But they made do. Now, Uncle Peter loved to talk about as much as he loved to fish, so when he would spot my granddad coming up the dirt track towards the house, he put whatever he was working on aside. Aunt Henrietta was prone to give him the stink eye for this, but she was fond of my granddad too, so she never said anything. It becomes a tradition of sorts for my grandfather to put a spare shirt in a sack, along with a treat of some kind that his mother made, and head off for Uncle Peter's every other weekend. He did this for years, right up until he married my grandmother. Usually, it was about dark when he'd set off, meaning it was well after sunset before he got there. The distance between his house and Uncle Peter's being in the reckoning of about 6 or 7 miles. Granddad tended to stay through Sunday, heading home after evening supper, which tended to be on the table well after dark. Suffice to say, there wasn't much to be afraid of back then, other than the local wildfire, and as I said before, as long as you minded your own business, they minded theirs. He'd been walking through the countryside at night all his life. He was comfortable and felt very safe. As had become a habit throughout the years, Granddad kissed Aunt Henrietta goodbye, shook Uncle Peter's hand, and started home at a brisk pace. It was autumn, so the air was pleasantly cool, a welcome relief from summer's oppressively humid heat. He said that there was a full moon that night, and when he would walk out in the open, it was fairly well lit. He could easily see where he was going. The dirt track that led away from Uncle Peter's shack meandered through a bit of marshland before it ended at the wider road. Usually, he didn't take that route unless he felt like a bit of a wanderer, since cutting through the fields and woodland was a straighter shot back to his parents' farmhouse, and the road slithered and slunk its way around the far side of the lake before curving back in the direction of home. That night, however, with the moonlight and the refreshing nip in the wind, Granddad felt the urge to do a little bit of meandering. Turning at the end of the road, he stepped onto the road, barefoot as a jaybird, and softly whistling to himself. The route was so familiar that he hardly paid any attention to the surroundings, letting his feet do most of the work while he occupied himself with other thoughts. Before he knew it, he was approaching the lake. The water was calm that night, dark and still. He slowed down a little, wanting to watch the way the light rippled and shimmered gently. It was such a pretty sight that he nearly missed what was standing not far up the road. At first, it was just a silhouette, a tall and solid-looking shadow that seemed to be facing the water. Granddad thought it might have been a trick of the light initially. He'd walked through a cemetery once in the middle of the night and thought he'd seen a soldier riding a white horse, until he got closer and realized it was a large dewdrop spiderweb. As he drew nearer, he quickly realized that it wasn't his eyes. There was something standing on the other side of the road. In fact, it was a man. He could tell by the build, broad-shouldered and narrow at the hip, and he could tell by the clothes, even in the moonlight. It was evident that the man wore a dark suit that did not fit him well. A shapeless hat was on his head, causing his form to look elongated and odd-looking. From the distance of several feet, Granddad could see the shine of good shoes, polished until they picked up the water's gleam. The man was standing close to the water, so close in fact that the waves were lapping at those expensive-looking shoes. The lake's shifting reflection softly illuminated his face, and Granddad could make out strong features that had been weathered with time and toil. The lines around his mouth and eyes were distinctive as he smiled. That was when Granddad realized that the man was smiling at him. In fact, the man had been staring at him just as long or longer as Granddad had been doing the same. Quickly remembering his manners, he greeted the man politely. The man's expression didn't change as his head turned to follow my granddaddy's movement until he stopped on the other side of the road. A little unnerved, my grandfather stood awkwardly for a long moment, waiting for what he thought would be an appropriate amount of time for a reply. The man didn't speak. His face never changed, but he slowly brought his hand up and made a beckoning motion with his fingers, silently asking my granddad to come closer. Granddad shook his head. "No, sir. I can't stay and talk. I have to get home. You have a nice night." Dipping his head, my granddad started walking again, passing the strange man with a slightly quicker pace than he had been walking before. Feeling that he was being watched, he stopped again a little further up the road. He turned to look back to see the man had turned around so that he was facing the direction my granddad was going, still staring at him. But now, he was waist deep in water. Confused and shocked, Granddad could only gape at the man as he stood in the lake, that same grin on his face as he lifted his hand and beckoned again. Shaking his head quickly, my granddad repeated what he'd said before, the words out of his mouth before he could think about how weird they sounded now. "No, sir. I can't stay and talk. I have to get home. You have a nice night." He whipped around and started walking even faster up the road, listening for the sound of splashing or footsteps behind him, but there was nothing, and that's when it struck him. He never heard a sound, no splash, no drip, no scuffle of shoes against dirt. Silence. Closing in on the trees, he felt a shiver run down his back as the feeling of being watched washed over him again. He froze on the spot. Everything in him was telling him to just keep walking and not to stop until he was through his mother's kitchen door. But there was an even stronger urge to turn around, to look back one more time. The compulsion was too much to resist. He turned again to look at the lake. The man was still there, only now the water was up to his shoulders now, and he was still smiling. Even from the distance of several yards in the dark, Granddad somehow knew the man was still smiling. There was movement, and he saw the man lift his hand a third time, motioning for him to come back, to come closer, to come into the water. Granddad wasn't sure which, or even if it was any one of those things, but he never found out. Without a word, he turned to face the trees and walked away. He walked the 7 miles home, unnerved and perplexed, and for the next 80 years until his death at the age of 91, he never figured out who the man was, why he was there, or what he wanted. Over and over again, he told us the story, the same story. The encounter clearly haunted him. It haunts me. I shuddered to what would have happened had my granddad actually gotten close to the man or lingered by the lake that night. But the one thing that stuck out in my mind about his experience, more than anything, is that the man stood neck deep in water and didn't even make a ripple.